You said that you are still very restrictive on rates, which is also kind of a point for debate, because the economy is doing very well. So where do you see it being very restrictive?
Well, the economy was weaker in the first half of the year versus where it had been last year.
That was trade, wasn't it? Imports and exports, stocking up before the tariffs.
Well, it was potentially related to trade. It was related to trade, to some front running of tariffs. It was related to some uncertainty around trade and taxes, I mentioned before. But I do think other elements of core underlying domestic demand were weaker in the first half of the year than they had been in last year. Thus far, for the third quarter, we have very little data to give us indications for the third quarter. But I also think that the labor market has clearly weakened somewhat over the course of the year, and the unemployment rate has ticked up, has been moving up gradually in the recent past. So, I don't, and then you sort of look at something like the housing market, right? And housing is one of the biggest, if not the biggest transmission channel of monetary policy into the real economy. And that has been, I think rather moribund for a while now. On
high rates, mortgage rates.
Largely on high rates, yeah.
But if the Fed lowers rates, it's not guaranteed that mortgage rates will come down. We didn't see that last year.
So that's a great point. And so, last year, I thought that cutting was the wrong move, right? And it's related to this neutral rate conversation we were just having. So I thought last year the neutral rate was much higher due to a variety of factors, including things like population growth being higher, including things like deficits being wider, that raised the neutral rate. Which means that if neutral was here, so if keep policy here and neutral's up here, then I think that policy is not very restrictive. And so I thought that cutting last year wasn't necessarily the right move. If neutral has come down and you keep policy here, then the distance between them has grown. And so therefore policy became more restrictive, even though you kept the nominal rate relatively similar. And so that, in my mind, is reasons for cutting. And so that's why I thought last year it was a mistake to cut, and this year it's the right move to cut.
And the market told you that, and you think this year market will go along.
Exactly. So in the, I think, 18 trading sessions since we cut rates in September, long yields are, I think, like 4 or 5 basis points down. In the same 18 sessions after the Fed cut rates last September, they were up by approximately 30 basis points. And then they went from starting from 30 to go all the way to about 110 basis points up.
When are we going to get to 2% inflation?
So, to 2% headline measured PCE.
Headline PCE. That's Fed target, right?
Yeah, I think probably, let's say, a year and a half from now or so, if I remember correctly, where my dots were.
A year and a half from now.
Yeah, approximately.
And where does unemployment go in that time?
Well, I think unemployment probably edges slightly down. Not really far down, but probably slightly down. But that's also consistent upon actually accomplishing the policy outlook that I'm just giving you where my dots were, right? That also is reliant upon policy actually, sort of moving down. I worry that if policy stays this restrictive for that much longer, then the Fed itself will induce a slowdown in the economy because policy is so restrictive.
Are people right to raise the question about Fed independence right now?
I think that Fed independence is of critical importance.
Why?
Well, because you want to have policy decisions being made for the Congress assigned to the Fed the mandate of stable prices and maximum employment, right? You want to have policies being made for those purposes and not to manage to some political or electoral cycle. Calendar, right? So you want to have those decisions insulated from the political cycle in Washington. So I think that's important. However, I also think that in order for the Fed to remain independent, it has to be seen as non-political. And that's why it's so important that we avoid mission creep from the core mandates that the Congress assigned to us into areas like climate change, into areas like entering the fray of highly charged racial politics. It is really important that the Fed not get involved in heavily politicized subjects that are outside of its core mandate, because if it does, it will cease to be viewed as non-political, and that independence becomes under threat. So I do think that independence is of critical importance, and I think that the Fed can and will do a much better job